On the 24th, which is 2 weeks from tonight, I will be speaking at a youth camp in East Rosebud, so we will not have class on the 24th. And then on the 1st, 8th, and 15th, we'll have the classes will run about an hour and 20 minutes to an hour and a half. Because there's some of the stuff in like Daniel chapters 10 and 12 are very, very small. So we can get those we can get 12 with chapter 11 and then 10 with chapter 9. And chapter 9 is the most pivotal chapter of all of it. I'll have more handouts for you. So next week we'll meet for the regular hour or hour and 5 minutes or however long we go. Then the following week, the 24th, we won't be meeting. Then the 1st, 8th, and 15th will go for probably about an hour and a half. So, and that one, definitely be ready to ask questions because there's a lot of heavy stuff in that. But I think if I do my job right, we'll have some fun with it. And if you guys don't like history, tonight you should not have come. Because we're gonna look at Daniel chapter 5, and actually there are 6 very important pieces of outside archaeological literature that has been found, and ancient written history that have nothing to do with the book of Daniel other than the reality that it matches up and connects with what Daniel says in this book. So this is where this stuff, in my mind, gets really, really interesting. I'm going to be reading from some different ancient historical texts. And what they do that's really, really neat, and I'm sure Daniel 5 is the story of the handwriting on the wall, okay? And so what these outside historical things do that's really neat is they basically serve as kind of filler to the historical part of the story. That being said, the historical part of the story, the historical parts are not the most important part for the biblical account. It's the theological, religious application. That's the most important, okay? So, having said that, I'm going to be reading a lot tonight, so just for brief review, Daniel's name means God is my judge. This will once again be the theme for tonight's chapter because of what Daniel, when he interprets the handwriting on the wall, which is also very fascinating. We'll get into that in just a minute. It reveals that, God is in control of the situation. That's the first thing. The second thing that is I want you to remind you of is, remember what I said, that the book of Daniel is originally written in 2 different languages, Hebrew and Aramaic, and we're in the Aramaic portion. And my theory, my hypothesis, and I'm not alone in this, I didn't come up with it, like Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to ideas. So the people that the people that are the titans of theology that have interpreted this stuff, I'm just plagiarizing it, okay? But what my point is that, remember what we've said, the book of Daniel is like God's plan being a train, and the 2 tracks being the two plans that he's using to accomplish his divine plan. Remember, we use that analogy or metaphor. You've got the one track that is for Gentiles, the non-Jews, and then you've got the other track that is for God's chosen people. They're going the same direction. They're parallel with one another, but God has one plan, and that's the train, right? And as you'll see with people like Belshazzar, when you get in front of the train, it doesn't end well for you. I can't think of anyone that's going to win that battle of getting in front of a train. So before we read the 31 verses of Daniel chapter 5, and we won't read them all at once, we'll break them down. Before we go through those, I want to talk about the history, because between Daniel chapter 4 verse 37 and Daniel chapter 5 verse 1, there is a 70-year span. And what's important to understand about this is that what we're going to see is that later in Daniel's chapters 6 and 7, he talks about events that happened in between Daniel 4:37 and Daniel 5:1. Does that make sense? So, in other words, the book of Daniel is not in chronological order. It's in thematic order. It fits the theme perfectly, but what you're going to see in chapter 6 and chapter 7, or excuse me, in chapter 7 and chapter 8, maybe it is 6 and 7. No. Well, anyway, I'll read you the passages in just a minute. But what you'll see is that the prophecies that Daniel makes, the visions that he sees, the things that he hears, happen during that 70-year span in between the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. Okay? But remember what happened at the end of chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar was judged for his arrogance, even though he was at that time the greatest king over the largest empire the world had ever seen. And he acted like a cow, and we talked about all that. But then it was his power and his throne were restored to him when he confessed God as the one true God. And remember, we talked about how it reads in Aramaic. It read that he was continuing to confess. So it was something that he was actively doing. Remember talking about that? So having said that then, we need to talk about the 70 years leading up to Daniel chapter 5, because what it does is it really, really helps us understand the context of the biblical narrative. And like my hermeneutics professor used to say, context is the most important aspect of understanding the scriptures. Whether it's historical context or cultural context or whatever, if you understand the context, you'll better understand what's going on. That's true with anything in life, right? You can come across a couple having a heated disagreement and think that something's about ready to go terribly wrong, or there's abuse or whatever, and then come to find out they're filming for a TikTok. Or, you know what I'm saying? If we have to understand context, or we can take things completely and misinterpret them completely. So having said that, the 70 years in between, the 70 years that occur involve the Babylonian Empire's, let me back up. I'm struggling tonight. From Daniel 1:1 to Daniel 4:37, that is a 70-year time period that involves the Babylonian Empire's last greatest king, which is Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? And chapter 5 talks about the Babylonian Empire's last king. If you get out this handout, if you have it, on the back side of this historical timeline of Israel handout, and by the way, I finally gave all these physical handouts to Shana, and she's going to scan them and put them on the website along with the lectures. You'll see that Nabopolassar was the first king. Nebuchadnezzar was the second king. We've talked about him extensively in the first 4 chapters. And then it says on this list here that Nabonidus was the last king. And technically that's true, even though we're going to talk about a guy named Belshazzar tonight. But that's where the history comes in. That's where we need to understand what's going on. So, in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, there were 4 other kings. Okay? Now, there are 6 very important pieces of archaeological literature that give us the details of this time period in between chapter 4, verse 37 and chapter 5, verse 1. And none of these 6 pieces of literature are biblical, but they're all really important. I'm going to go through these slowly in case you want to write them down and look them up, because it's kind of cool. The first one is what's known as the Babylonian Chronicle. The second one is called the History of Babylon. The History of Babylon, and I'm going to quote from this guy, was written by a Babylonian priest by the name of Berosus. It's spelled Berosus. He wrote it in the 3rd century BC, which, as you'll see, was, a couple hundred years after the events of chapter 5. And he wrote, interestingly enough, for the Greeks, because by the 3rd century BC, the Greeks were the prominent power. They were moving the Persians out of the area, and his writings are in Koine Greek, so they've been preserved very well. The third piece of literature is from a cuneiform tablet found in Babylon itself, the city of Babylon, that dates to the 6th century BC. We're going to talk about this tablet because it was found with several hundred other tablets, and one of them I guarantee you've heard of. But we'll get to that in just a minute, okay? And this cuneiform tablet mentions Belshazzar, okay? The fourth one is what's known as the Nabonidus. Is that the fourth one or the? Okay, the fourth one is what's known as the Nabonidus cylinder. And basically, it's an obelisk like the one that I showed you in this handout that I gave you when we talked about Nebuchadnezzar's tower, okay, that made of gold. And the Nabonidus cylinder details the rule of the empire's last king. The fifth piece of literature I'm going to read from tonight is called the writings of Herodotus. He was a Greek historian, okay? Now, you may ask, well, how did he know what was going on back then? It all gets back to what was in Alexandria. Remember, the King Ptolemy, who was one of Alexander's generals, Alexandria had already been built, obviously, and named after Alexander, but that's where he placed his capital, and he started gathering all of the written information he had from the Greek Empire, and a lot of it came from Babylon. So when the Greek historian Herodotus wrote, he was actually writing from what he had researched in the library in Alexandria, okay? That's the fifth one. And then the sixth one is an apocryphal writing. Remember what we said the Apocrypha was last week. It's all those books that are written in the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that 400 and some odd years of silence between the last words of Malachi and the first words of Matthew. And this apocryphal writing was entitled The Prayer of Nabonidus, and it detailed Nabonidus' absence from Babylon, allowing Belshazzar to rule. And we'll get into who Belshazzar is in a second. All six of these, so Babylonian Chronicle, the history of Babylon, a cuneiform tablet, and I'll give you the number of it because they don't give them titles, they give them numbers. The Nabonidus cylinder, the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, and the prayer of Nabonidus. These are the six historical accounts that we'll use as filler for all of the biblical stuff, okay? All six of these pieces of ancient literature not only give us tremendous historical insight into what was going on in Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BC, but they also validate Daniel's account of the events of chapter 5. Believe it or not, there actually is some historical precedence for the handwriting on the wall archaeologically, and we'll talk about that in a minute, okay, which is kind of cool, okay? When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, he was succeeded by his son, a guy by the name of Evil-Merodach. And evil is the English translation of it. His name is actually Amel-Marduk, but it translates into English as Evil-Merodach. I always thought that was kind of an unfortunate name. If you're named Evil, it's kind of like nobody names their kid like Adolf, or you don't see anybody with that little mustache anymore. He totally ruined that fashion trend, right? Or nobody, so anyway, all that to say, Evil-Merodach, or Amel-Marduk, was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He reigned for 2 years. He is actually also mentioned in the scriptures. If you go to Jeremiah chapter 52, verses 31 through 34, it says this: Now it came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th of the month, that Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, showed favor to Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. So that's Jeremiah chapter 52, verses 31 through 34. That prophetic book identifies Nebuchadnezzar's son, Amel-Marduk, as a real person. The other biblical passage that talks about him is 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 through 30. when it says, now came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that Evil-Merodach king, basically says the same thing, okay? Now again, why is that important? Who cares? Well, this is very important for people that try to discredit the Bible as being a myth or just a collection of allegories or fables or something like that. No, there's historical precedence for all of it, okay? So that's really, really, really important. Now, unfortunately, Amel-Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's son, was assassinated by his brother, Neriglissar, or his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. And Neriglissar is also mentioned in the Bible. He's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 39, verses 3 and 13. And Amel-Marduk was assassinated by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, because as Berosus, remember he was the Babylonian priest, as Berosus writes, this prince, and he was talking about Evil-Merodach, whose government was arbitrary and licentious, so he kind of lived up to his name, I guess, whose government was arbitrary and licentious, fell a victim to a plot, being assassinated by his sister's husband after a reign of 2 years. Now, that assassination, we know, based on Babylonian history, occurred in August of 560 BC. Now, Berosus goes on to write this, and this is really, really interesting. On his death, meaning Amel-Marduk, Neriglissar, his murderer, succeeded to the throne and reigned 4 years. His son, Labrosarodak, a mere boy, occupied the throne and occupied it for 9 months when, owing to the depraved disposition which he showed, a conspiracy was formed against him, and he was beaten to death by his friends. I think I don't know why I find that funny, but it's like they're his friends. I wonder what his enemies were like then, right? After his murder, the conspirators held a meeting and by common consent confirmed the kingdom upon Nabonidus, a Babylonian and one of their gang. In the 17th year of Nabonidus' reign, Cyrus advanced from Persia with a large army and, after subjugating the rest of the kingdom, marched upon Babylon. Apprised of his coming, Nabonidus led his army to meet him, fought, and was defeated, whereupon he fled with a few followers and shut himself up in the town of Borsippa, a town that still exists in Iraq today, by the way. Cyrus took Babylon, and after giving orders to raise the outer walls of the city because it presented a very redoubtable and formidable appearance, proceeded to Borsippa to besiege Nabonidus. The latter, surrendering without waiting for investment, was humanely treated by Cyrus, who dismissed him from Babylon, but gave him Carmania for his residence. There Nabonidus spent the remainder of his life, and there he died. Now, one thing that's really important about that account of Herodotus is that it doesn't say anything about Belshazzar, okay, or Belshazzar. And that's important because what that did was it allowed text critics and critics of the scriptures to, for years, decades, discredit the biblical account, saying there was no such person as Belshazzar, okay? Berosus doesn't talk about him, nor does Herodotus. So the account of Daniel 5 was deemed as mythical until the 1800s, when a massive amount of cuneiform tablets were unearthed in the remains of Babylon. Now, the most well-known of the tablets was one that you've probably heard of. It was called the Epic of Gilgamesh. You heard of this before? Have you ever heard of this? It talks about basically a universal flood and some other stories with regards to Gilgamesh. But from a biblical standpoint, the most important tablet unearthed was tablet number 135. This is the cuneiform tablet we're talking about. Tablet number 135. The reason it is so important from a biblical standpoint is because it is on this tablet that Belshazzar is mentioned. He is referred to as, quote, an officer of the king When Neriglissar, the brother-in-law of poor evil Merodach that got assassinated, when Neriglissar came to the throne in 560, end quote. Later, when the Nabonidus cylinder was unearthed in 1853 at the ancient temple of Shamash, the cylinder talked about the reign, and I believe if I remember correctly, Shamash is in Borsippa. The cylinder talked about the reign of Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar. So we know, even though he's not listed on your timeline here as one of the kings, because he wasn't technically the king, he ruled with his father as a co-regent, okay? And he was the great-grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Now, the Nabonidus cylinder also talks of Nabonidus spending the vast majority of his rule at a place called the Oasis of Tema. I looked this up. If you want to do it online, this place is pretty amazing. It's in, I actually want to visit it, but it's in northwest Saudi Arabia, and it's like in the middle of the desert, and it's this massive oasis, and it is absolutely beautiful. Like crystal clear water. You look it up. Oh yeah, Tema is spelled T-E-I-M-A if you want to look it up. The Oasis of Tema. So Nabonidus, for whatever reason, the ancient history doesn't say, decided that he wanted to spend the vast majority of his rule at the Oasis of Tema, and obviously he ruled for just under 17 years. This would validate why his son, Belshazzar, was left in Babylon to rule during his father's absence. Babylonian history does tell us, it doesn't tell us why Nabonidus decided to spend so much time in Tema, but it does tell us that his stay in Tema began in 553 BC, 2 years after he became king, which means that Belshazzar ruled in his father's place until the fall of the city of Babylon on October 12th, 539 BC. Okay? You tracking with me so far? So for a couple of centuries, people are like, yeah, Daniel 5 is a joke. It's not real. And then the archaeology starts to show up, and then it proves that, yeah, Belshazzar was an actual person. Now, in addition, as I read in Berosus's Chronicles, that when Nabonidus heard that Cyrus and the Persian armies had entered the Babylonian plain, his army marched out to meet them and was soundly defeated. And when they defeated, he did not run to Babylon. He went to Borsippa, as Berosus writes. Borsippa is a temple city southwest of Babylon, about 10 miles. And that is why Belshazzar would have been in command the night Babylon was captured. Make sense? So Nabonidus is defeated on the Babylonian plain, which is a massive plain right outside. It's in between the Euphrates and the Tigris. And it's a massive plain right outside the city of Babylon. But he didn't run to Babylon. For whatever reason, he went to Borsippa instead. In addition to this, the way that Babylon fell and the way that Daniel 5 talks about it gives an indication that Belshazzar's feast was done out of arrogance and without fear of the Persians and the Medes. It was also done, I think, to instill confidence in the Babylonian people because their army had just been defeated on the plain of Babylon. Now, why is this the case? According to the Babylonian Chronicle, one of the other 6 pieces of literature. Listen to this. This is insane. I mean, this doesn't even exist. Even if it existed today, it would be pointless because we have airplanes and bombs and things like that. The city of Babylon had a 20-year food supply. And the Euphrates River ran directly through the city from north to south. Actually, it goes northwest. So the Euphrates runs this way, and there's a channel called the Kibar River, and then Babylon was built right over the river, okay? Which did 2 things. It gave the inhabitants a constant water supply, and also fish. Okay? So while it had a 20-year supply of food, it had consistent water and fish as well. In addition to this, the several sets of walls around the city, and by the way, to this point, to this date, archaeologists have found 42 miles worth of walls. The city itself had a circumference of 17 miles, and they've unearthed 42 miles of walls. But the sets of walls, there's more than one set. This is insane. The sets of walls around the city were built with a canal in between two sets of walls for a flood defense. Now, this is kind of interesting. So the outside wall, I'm going to tell you how big it was. The outside main wall, it's massive, okay? But in between the outside wall and the next set of walls, they built this huge canal. And the reason is they learned from their own history. The way that the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians and conquered Nineveh was because Nineveh was also built over what's called the Kesar River. It's like Qasar. I can't think of how it's spelled, okay? And it ran north to south as well. What the Babylonians decided to do, because they knew they couldn't get into Nineveh, it wasn't built as massively as this, but it was pretty impressive, was they went to the south of the city and they built a dam. Well, the water started backing up, and you know what erosion and lots of water can do to buildings and walls, and anyone ever had their basement flooded, you know, right? And it caved in the walls. Why is that important? The book of Nahum was a minor prophet, predicted that very thing. He told the Assyrians, Nahum's a book that prophesies against Assyria, and he told the Assyrians Nineveh would be overcome by a flood, and it was. So the Babylonians said, well, it worked when we did it, so we don't want to suffer the same fate. So they built this massive outside wall, and then in case the Persians wanted to flood the walls, in between the outside wall and the inside wall, they built a massive canal so all the water would flood into the canal, and then they would drain it out on the sides of the city. So they had everything thought of. But listen to this. The outer wall was 87 feet thick and anywhere from 200 to 300 feet high. There were three sets of inner walls, 11 to 21 feet thick, and anywhere from 100 to 200 feet high. So the idea was if the outer walls were breached, they could just continue to back in. And they always had their water supply, and the food supply was in the middle of the city, so they could retreat further into the city. In addition to this, on the outer wall, every 60 feet were 420-foot towers tall. I mean, these are 40-story buildings today, right? They would be, taller than any of the buildings in Billings. These are massive, okay? So the city itself was magnificent, but its defenses were actually an architectural masterpiece. It's easy to see why Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 could look out over that and go, this is incredible, and I've done it. Because he did, right? Until he became a cow. All right. So Belshazzar's confidence in his defenses would have been warranted. However, he didn't know what the Persians were doing several miles north of the city. And I'm going to read that from Herodotus' history here in a minute. Biblical historians believe that Belshazzar gave the feast outlined in Daniel chapter 5 because he wanted to inspire the confidence of the people after his father's defeat on the Babylonian plain. And because of Nebuchadnezzar's foresight, the city had been built to withstand a long siege. I mean, you got 2 decades worth of food. That is way too long for, you're going to have a mutiny in the army trying to take that city, right? It's just, they have families. They don't want to be outside a city for 20 years, okay? Now, we'll get into how the city was taken here as I go through the text. But there's one more thing that's super important to point out, and that is this. Look at Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. It says this. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. And he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Okay? Now turn over to Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. That would have been, by the way, that would have been 553 BC. That's the year that Nabonidus went to Tema, to the oasis of Tema. Tracking with me so far? So that would have been the first year of Belshazzar's reign, even though he wasn't running, he was reigning over Babylon, just not over the empire. Now, chapter 8, verse 1 says this: In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. So the vision of chapter 7 occurred in 553 BC. The vision of chapter 8 occurred in 551 BC. Now, we're going to go through what Daniel sees in those visions because it is prophetic. But it plays a huge role in the story, and here's why. Because when Daniel confidently tells Belshazzar, when he interprets the handwriting on the wall, that he's done, it's because he knew it was going to happen, because of the visions that he had in 553 and 551 in chapter 7 and 8. Does that make sense? Really, really important to understand because, again, the book is not written chronologically, but thematically. The theme of Daniel is following along with God is the judge, God is sovereign, God is going to accomplish his will and his plan. So Daniel was able to tell Belshazzar not only what the handwriting on the wall meant, and by the way, all of Belshazzar's advisors could read it, but they couldn't interpret it. And I'll explain why that is the case in just a minute. It's actually pretty interesting. So, all that to say, Daniel knew what was going to happen because Belshazzar is mentioned in 7 and 8, and he is killed in chapter 5. So, having said that, let's look at the first 4 verses of chapter 5 now that we've already gone halfway through the class and not even read a single Bible. Well, actually, we've read some Bible verses. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So, Belshazzar throws a feast, and given the language, the Aramaic of chapter 5, verse 2, his orders to bring in the holy vessels from the temple, which his great-grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had plundered, came after he was drunk. Okay? The way that it reads is that he was feeling no pain. Okay? So he gets drunk and he asks for the vessels from the temple. Now, scoot over to chapter 5, verse 13. Or excuse me, chapter 5, verse 22. Actually, we'll start in 21. Daniel is interpreting or is telling Belshazzar what's going to happen. He said, he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar's great-grandfather. He said, he was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. This is another reason why I think we'll see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. Yet you, his son, and we'll talk about that in a minute, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew this. Okay? Given what Daniel says there, Belshazzar knew he was committing an act of sacrilege. He knew what he was doing went against his great-grandfather Nebuchadnezzar's God Yahweh. This idolatrous and sacrilegious act was done against the God of Daniel and against the God of his great-grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. And here's what's crazy. In Akkadian, Belshazzar's name means Bel, who is a Babylonian god, has protected the king. Well, we know the king ain't protected, right? This is going to end very badly for Belshazzar. So once again, God is showing that all the other gods are inferior and impotent when it comes to the one true God, okay? So Belshazzar's drunken act of sacrilegious stupidity leads to a supernatural response. Look at verses 5 through 9. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster, keep that word in mind, of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. I'm going to read this, the literal translation from Aramaic. It's hilarious. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, his face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. Now, something that is really, really cool from an archaeological aspect. When archaeologists were uncovering Nebuchadnezzar's palace, they uncovered a large throne room in the palace that was 173 feet long and 56 feet wide. On the long walls of the throne room, so not on the 56-foot walls, but the 173-foot walls, they uncovered that the walls were made completely in white plaster. Remember what 5 says on verse 5. The fingers of a man's hand emerged, began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall in the king's palace. Here's what's even cooler. The word for plaster, does anyone have anything different than plaster in your version? Okay, good. The word for plaster in Aramaic is giyr. It's spelled G-I-Y-R in English. And it does mean plaster, but its literal definition is chalk-like stone. It's like a chalkboard. Okay? So, the drunken revelry quickly turns to sober terror as the king saw a man's hand writing on the wall. Okay? I believe that it was the handwriting of Jesus. There's a whole theory behind that. I'm not going to get into it tonight. A lot of times theologians will refer to something like this as what's called an anthropomorphism. It's where you give human characteristics to God to try to describe him. Well, the reason I don't believe stuff like this is an anthropomorphism is because when God showed up in flesh, he showed up as a human. So giving human characteristics to God is quite appropriate because Jesus, when he came, didn't come as a donkey or a turtle. He came as a man. And this is also something when I teach doctrine to my students at the college. And I don't think we think about this enough. And I think it causes a lot of insecurity, and I think it causes a lot of especially because our culture is so shallow and so focused on the surface. But I always talk about being created in the image of God, right? The Imago Dei. We've all heard that before. Well, what does that actually mean? So when I teach doctrine class, I'll ask my students, okay, tell me some things that make us created in the image of God. What can we do that other breathing species can't do? Well, they start giving all kinds of, we're spiritual beings. You don't see cats going to church on Sunday. You know what I'm saying? We can communicate in intelligible and in intellectual ways. I mean, animals communicate, but not like we do, right? Animals aren't digging into animals don't have book clubs, stuff like that. All animals have base emotions, but we have like deeper emotions. There's all of there's a spiritual component to there's all of these different things that we have that other animals don't have. We are creative and artistic. A beaver dam 1,000 years ago looks identical to a beaver dam created today. But a dam built by human beings 1,000 years ago doesn't look like a dam built today, right? So there's that. There's all of these things that we have that make us created in the image of God. But I also think that we need to consider the fact that we're physically created in his image as well. And when we see God in heaven, we're going to see Christ, as is, scars and all, right? And so when you think about being, I always joke about my big ears, and my dad would always say I had a face for radio and all that stuff. And I'm not an insecure person, and actually I think it's pretty hilarious. But I'm created in his image from a physical standpoint. So each and every one of us, when he crafted you physically, he crafted you in his image exactly how he wanted you. And for us, most of us are older and we're pretty set in who we are and what we believe. But for college students, that's pretty profound because they're caught up in the culture and how everybody looks, and people are so vain. So it's one of those things where consider that as well, because we're created physically in the image of God, because Jesus Christ is the second person in the triune Godhead, and we see him as a man. Powerful stuff. All right. Having said that, now I got way ahead of my notes here. Okay. So Belshazzar sees what I believe is the hand of Christ. I don't think it's anthropomorphic. I think it's the actual hand of Jesus. Because, by the way, in Hebrews 13, verse 9, the author of the Hebrews says that what? Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And Jesus is one of the members of the Trinity. So he was, the pre-incarnate Christ was the man. Okay? How that works, I don't know. So, Belshazzar sees what I believe is the hand of Christ writing on the wall, and it absolutely terrifies him. He was so scared that in verse 6, it says the strength left his lower body and he almost fell. Literally in the Aramaic, it reads this way: the joints of his loins were loosed and his knees smote one another. I think that's hilarious. His knees were knocking and he couldn't, and probably part of that has to do with the fact that he was hammered. So you ever seen drunk people, or maybe you have been? I won't ask that question, but there's some difficulty walking and standing there. Okay, so verses 10 through 12. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles, and the queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation." He would either have been in his mid to late 70s or his early 80s. So because if it's 70 years from Daniel 1:1 to Daniel 5:1, and we talked about how young he would have been, he could have been anywhere from 8 to 15. Yeah, that would have meant he was mid 70s to mid 80s, right? So, as is usually the case, the voice of reason belongs to a woman, and the queen says, "Hey, hubby, Nebuchadnezzar, your father." Now, Daniel also calls Nebuchadnezzar Belshazzar's father. Well, we know from archaeological history and from this king's list that Nebuchadnezzar was not Belshazzar's father. He was actually his great-grandfather. And Nabonidus was Belshazzar's father. So what does she mean and what does Daniel mean? Well, this actually is a really easy problem to solve linguistically, because in Aramaic, in Greek, and in Hebrew, there is no word for grandfather or grandmother. There's no word for forefather, okay? So when they talk about your grandparents, they're just your fathers. Make sense? And so that's why sometimes you'll read genealogies if you're reading through your Bible in a year, and you'll talk about so and so was the father of so, and or the Pharisees will refer to themselves or will refer to Abraham as their father. Okay, obviously he's not their biological father, but they're all related to him, and that's why that was what it was. So we know that Belshazzar was the great grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, but the queen recommends that Belshazzar's wife calls for Daniel. Now go back to chapter 5, verse 8, because I want to read this. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. You may not have that in your English version, but in the Aramaic, it literally translates this way. But not they could the writing read, the interpretation thereof make known to the king. I'm going to read that again because it's kind of weird. But not they could the writing read, the interpretation thereof make known to the king. This is really important how it's worded here, because what it indicates is that they could read it, but they didn't understand it. Does that make sense? They could read it, but they didn't understand it. Now, let me explain this to you, because this is actually something that isn't a phenomenon to this chapter. I have a tattoo on my arm that's written in Hebrew. It's before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. It's from Jeremiah 1, okay? Now, when I was in Israel, my sons and I went down to the Jordan River, and there, because the Jordan River is the boundary or the border for Jordan, there is military presence on both sides of the river. And the river's not very big. It's like the ditch that runs through Billings, maybe about 4 or 5 feet wider. It's not a big river, okay? It's actually a lot like the ditch because it doesn't have like the Yellowstone River, you step into it and it keeps getting deeper and deeper as you get towards the middle. It gets deep. Once you step off its bank, you're in the river, right, up to however deep it is, okay? Now, I was wearing a tank top the day that, and I have a great picture of this because I'll tell you about that in a second, but I had a tank top on. Well, 2 Israeli soldiers approached me, and they asked me if I loved Israel, and I said, well, of course I do. And they were talking about, because I had a tattoo. Now, the tattoo on my arm is biblical Hebrew, which means they could read it, but they had no clue what it meant. Because Hebrew today and biblical Hebrew are different. Same letters, but just different. So they could read it, but they couldn't interpret it. What's hilarious about this story is that I asked the 2 soldiers, both of them just good-looking dudes, and one guy's got a grenade launcher and the other guy's got an automatic weapon. I said, can I take a picture of you and my son? So they all sat down with the Jordan River in the background, and my 2 sons sat in between them. The 2 soldiers flanked them, and the soldiers put their arms around my boys. And my son Connor has the most terrified look on his face, and I couldn't figure out why, and he said, Dad, look at the picture more closely. Well, the soldier sitting next to him on the outside, his grenade launcher was on his lap, but pointing right at Connor's groin. And Connor's just sitting there like, please don't do anything crazy. So anyway, that has nothing to do with Daniel. The whole point is that they could read what the writing on the wall was, but they did not know how to interpret it. Does that make sense? Okay, so look at verses 13 through 16. Belshazzar takes his wife's advice. Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom has been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations, solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple, wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the 3rd ruler of the kingdom. So Belshazzar calls in Daniel and tells him all that he'll give him if he interprets the writing. However, look at verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. Now, I have a theory, and I can't prove it, but I think it's kind of funny. Daniel doesn't want any of the gifts, nor does he want to be third in the kingdom. And by the way, he'd have been third because Belshazzar wasn't king, remember? Nabonidus, his father, was, so that would have made him third. And the reason I think, again, search the scriptures, see if these things are so, I believe that Daniel didn't want any of this because based on chapter 7, verse 1 and 8, verse 1, he knew this day was coming. He knew that Belshazzar's promise of wealth and power was totally pointless because it was all going to be over in a couple hours. Okay? So, 18 through 24. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed, and whomever he wished, he spared alive. Whomever he wished, he elevated, and whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was driven away from mankind. His heart was made like that of beasts. His dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. You have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven and have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand, but the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways you have not glorified. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Now, this is something else that I'm going to say that can't be verified by Scripture. Up to this point, when Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and people are like, well, where are they? If Daniel's in his mid to late 70s, they might have already passed away. Nobody knows, okay? But having said that, anytime you hear from them in the first 4 chapters, they always confess God from a personal testimonial standpoint. You notice this? In the past 4 weeks, we've seen this, right? Daniel takes a different approach with the great-grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He gave Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. And this is another reason why I believe we'll see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. Daniel doesn't say, you're profaning the Most High God, you're acting idolatrously, and you're mocking him. Daniel points out, look, your great-grandfather, this is what happened to him, and you know it. Because of course he would have known their history. And even though it's not written in the historical annals that Nebuchadnezzar went mad for a season of 7 years, his great-grandson would have known it, right? And Daniel points that out. I think Daniel took a different approach with Belshazzar from a testimonial of his great-grandfather's perspective, just because Nebuchadnezzar did believe. And again, that's an argument from silence. So Daniel recounts Belshazzar's great-grandfather's history in order to point out that not only has Belshazzar not looked at his great-grandfather's history and learned from his mistakes, but he has doubled down on his foolish pride by sacrilegiously serving false gods and defiling the holy vessels of Yahweh's temple. And because of this, the ultimate judge, remember what Daniel's name means, was handing down his judgment. Okay? Daniel's proclamation of Belshazzar's blasphemous deeds was stated without fear. And I think, obviously, this has been a consistent thing with him, right? But I think this was done because he knew exactly what was going to happen. Okay? He also states in verse 24 that the hand was sent from him. Catch that? Look at verse 24 again. Then the hand was sent from him, meaning God, and this inscription was written out. I think this is very significant because on a king's hand was worn his signet ring. Daniel has just said, you are mocking and blaspheming the Most High God, the King of Kings. Okay? So he sent you his hand. On the king's hand On his right hand was worn a signet ring, usually on his index finger. The signet ring was the sign of power, in that all decrees given by a king, when written on a scroll, were rolled up. Soft clay was put on the scroll to keep it rolled up, and then the king would take his signet ring and impress it into the clay. Make sense? This would say that it was basically his signature. Whether it was, I don't think they had an auto ring like we have an auto pen today. They had, but he had his signature, right? His signature ring. And that meant that whatever was rolled up and written in that scroll came directly from the king. By the way, this is a total side note, but when the scroll with the 7 seals is opened in the book of Revelation, it ties into this whole thing. It's really, really neat and really, really cool. Okay? So that's what's happening there. And because the writing itself and the supernatural nature with which it was done, it was basically a sealed decree displaying the true God's power. Look at verse 25 to 28. Now, this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you've been weighed on the scales and found deficient or wanting. Perez, your kingdom, or upharsin, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Okay? Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Believe it or not, there is much debate over the translation of these 4 words due to a variety of factors. This is kind of cool. I think it is. You'll think this is probably really dumb. Number 1, were the 4 words written on the wall in Aramaic by God's hand, or only identified as Aramaic in Daniel's book? Okay? Does that make sense? Those 4 words that you see written in your Bible are English transliterations of Aramaic words. Okay? So were they written in Aramaic? Were they written in the usual writing of cuneiform, as was the custom in Babylonian writings? Now, and that's important because some of the writings would go vertical. Was mene, mene, tekel, upharsin written vertically or horizontally? And was it interpreted from right to left, as you interpret Aramaic and Hebrew, or left to right? Or was it interpreted from north to south? You ever see Chinese writing? You don't know what it is, but they write up to down, right? Now, the other thing is, okay, if it was written in Aramaic, did it include vowels or no vowels? Now, this may sound really ridiculous, but hear me out on this. The Hebrew language has no vowels. There aren't any. The closest thing to it is a yod. It's an apostrophe. So it's known as a yod. And it would be a Y in our language. And you know, our Ys are sometimes considered vowels and sometimes aren't. Now, if you look at the Hebrew on my arm, you'll see little dots and lines and stuff. Those are what are known as vowel markers. When Hebrew kids take grammar, they use vowel markers so they'll know how to pronounce a word. But if you go over to Israel today, all you don't see vowel markers on the signs, the road signs or the signs for the shops or whatever. You just see it because they don't use vowels. They just know how to write or how to pronounce it. That makes a big difference in here because there's plenty of vowels in these 4 words, okay? Now, all of this makes a difference, and you're probably thinking, I could care less. All of this makes a difference because depending on how they were worded, vertically, horizontally, with vowels or no vowels, could completely change the name or the meaning of the word. So, let me explain how this works. If they were Aramaic, which is probably the best way to interpret it since this portion of Daniel is written in Aramaic, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin would be translated numbered, weighed, divided. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Numbered, weighed, divided. Okay? Now, if it was translated that way, it would be easy to see why Belshazzar's wise men could read it, but they didn't have a clue what it meant. Can you imagine some hand just comes out, numbered, weighed, divided? And by the way, I forgot to mention this. When I was in Sunday school way back in the days of flannel graphs, the handwriting on the wall story was always this massive hand. That's not indicated here. This is what made it probably so freaky. Well, isn't the Addams Family the show where the hand just wanders around and does stuff? Yeah. So it would have just been like if it was my size. So we're all sitting here. All of a sudden, I look over on that wall and I'm like, and you guys look and it's just a hand, nothing else, but not a big one, just a normal hand. So it wasn't something that was massive. But if this hand writes numbered, weighed, divided, then no wonder they didn't have a clue. And no wonder Daniel did, because the prophecies of chapter 7 and chapter 8, which happened before this, would have given him an indication of exactly how to interpret it. Now, if it was written vertically, it would change the meaning of the words to numbered, weighed Persians, which would still have been just as confusing. So if it was in Aramaic, it's numbered, weighed, divided. If it's cuneiform, it's numbered, weighed Persians. Well, they're all going, what in the world is going on here? Regardless of the word's constructs, Daniel knows what they mean, and he tells Belshazzar that his kingdom is done. So look at verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom, an authority that he would have held for less than 24 hours. Okay? Verses 30 and 31. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain, so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Now I want to read a very interesting quote, and we'll kind of end it with this. A very interesting account taken from the Greek historian Herodotus. Herodotus lived from 484 to 425 BC. So he would have been born roughly 55 years after this happened. Okay? And he explains how the Persians defeated the Babylonians. Because it is kind of weird. I just read the dimensions of the city. How in the heck did they get in? How in the heck did they do this very night, right after Nabonidus' army had been defeated? Listen to what Herodotus writes. Cyrus then, after he defeats Nabonidus, advanced against Babylon. But the Babylonians, having taken the field, awaited his coming, and when he had advanced near the city, the Babylonians gave battle, and being defeated, shut themselves up in the city. But as they had long been aware of the restless spirit of Cyrus and saw that he attacked all nations alike, they had laid up provisions for many years, and therefore were under no apprehensions about a siege. On the other hand, Cyrus found himself in difficulty, since much time had elapsed and his affairs were not at all advanced. Nothing changes in politics. Politicians start getting very, very nervous when wars aren't won quickly, right? Because they worry more about their power than they do about us. Nothing has changed. Whether therefore someone else made the suggestion to him in his perplexity, or whether he himself devised the plan, he had recourse to the following strategy. This is crazy. Having stationed the bulk of his army near the passage of the river where it enters Babylon, so he stationed the vast majority of his army northwest of the city, and again having stationed another division beyond the city where the river makes its exit, southeast of the city, okay, he gave orders to his forces to enter the city as soon as they should see the river fordable. Having stationed his forces and given these directions, he himself marched away with the ineffective part of his army, and having come to the lake, Cyrus did the same with respect to the river and the lake as the queen of the Babylonians had done. Now let me explain what's going on here. When it says the ineffective part of his army, it doesn't mean guys that are wounded, or it's the cooks and the people that take care of the animals and the people that haul the armor. It's all the support. Okay? What they did, if you see a map of Babylon today, you got to really zone in on it tight. Northwest of Babylon, there is a lake. Now, before Cyrus did this, it was merely a swamp. Okay? So he took all of his ineffective forces, and listen to what they did. For having diverted the river by means of a canal into the lake, which was before a swamp, he made the ancient channel of the Euphrates fordable by sinking the water level of the river. Remember, the river goes under the city walls, okay, and into the city. So rather than try to flood them out like the Babylonians had done to the Assyrians, he said, we'll just divert most of the water and the lake will get lower and lower and lower. The Persians who were appointed to that purpose, close to the stream of the river, which had now subsided to about the middle of a man's thigh, entered Babylon by this passage. Now, this is the key that ties it to Daniel's account. If the Babylonians had been aware of this beforehand or had known what Cyrus was about, they would not have suffered the Persians to enter the city, but would have utterly slaughtered them, having shut all the sluice gates that lead to the river, and mounting the walls that extend along the banks of the river, they would have caught them as in a net. Remember I said there was a canal that was built in between. If all those guys are under there, they're sitting ducks, okay? But listen. Whereas the Persians came upon them by surprise. It is related by the people who inhabited this city that by reasons of its great extent, when they who were at the extremities were taken, those of the Babylonians who inhabited the center of the city knew nothing of the capture, for it happened to be a festival, and they were dancing at the time and enjoying themselves and drinking till they received certain information of the truth, and thus Babylon was taken. Remember what Daniel 5 says. They're partying. They're saying, nobody can take us, and they're all drunk. And so, the other interesting thing is that there are a lot of scholars that believe that the Jews that inhabited Babylon at that time helped the Persians get into the city, which is probably accurate because the relationship between the Persians and the Jews was a very tight one. Nehemiah was a cupbearer of the king. Esther was the queen of a Persian king. The list goes on and on and on, right? So, the Persians diverted the river into a lake or a swamp northwest of Babylon by building a canal and then damming it up. This dropped the water level to a low enough depth that the Persians just waded under the walls and broke through the sluice gates. And because, as Herodotus points out, and so does Daniel, the Babylonians were drunk and partying inside the city, it was all done but the crying. Interestingly enough, both Isaiah the prophet and Jeremiah the prophet predicted this very thing decades, Jeremiah, and centuries, Isaiah, earlier. If you want to read about that, you can find it in Isaiah 13, Isaiah 21, and Jeremiah 51. Now, here's the deal. You may think it's kind of hard that a story like this can be applied to our everyday lives. But I think it very much well can. Once again, we see Daniel living without fear. And I talked about this a few weeks ago when everything was going crazy and had to speak in church and bore every one of you. But we have to constantly remind ourselves that we need to fear God more than we fear men. That is a very, very important aspect. And here's the other thing about this that I think is very applicable. History and the Bible confirm our faith. They really, really do. I mean, wouldn't you agree? This stuff is too good not to be true. And so I think that's important for us to be mindful of. All right, let's pray and we'll quit. I did go over. I apologize. Lord, thanks for this day. Thank you for the opportunity to dig through your word. What a cool, cool thing. Lord, I love the fact that we can look at ancient history and we can look at your word, and your word is validated by ancient history, and ancient history is validated by your word. Lord, we love you. I pray that we always fear you more than we fear men. Amen.